I do not think we're going back to the shining vision of the post 1945 liberal international order. That is an artifact of 20th century politics. It's an artifact of World War II and the victors of World War II and the lessons of World War I and World War II. Terrible, terrible lessons that said the world will do better when states can come together, at least on areas of common interest. And it was not an idealist vision. The UN was created with Franklin Roosevelt understanding that you needed the four policemen at the table, ultimately the five permanent members of the Security Council. But it's a vision of the world with a fairly limited number of states and of course, really two blocks more than anything else. Those two blocks paralyzed its operation for many years during the Cold War, but there were times you could get everybody on side or somebody abstained and the UN could work. But also, the economic order was mostly the Western order because the communist nations didn't play. And then after the Cold War, you have a decade where things really do look like they're working pretty well. That's also because the United States is a hyperpower during that decade. But there are just too many factors that require major evolution of that order. One is just rising and returning powers, and in different configurations. So it's not two blocks anymore, but as Russia comes back, as China comes back, and I say comes back because they have, certainly in China's case, they were a great power long before the United States or North America was on the chessboard map.
That's right.
But and powers like Iran too. I mean, it's not just China and Russia. Those factors mean the institutions that were premised on a sort of Western order are having to grapple with non-Western powers or non-democratic powers, depending how you want to think about it. But again, I also think that those were institutions set up for problems states were the primary actors on. If it were tariffs, well, yes, you need national governments. If it's arms, you need national governments. If it's just fundamental war and peace or imposing an ideology from top down, communism, capitalism, you needed governments. Today, if you said, what are the top 5 things that ought to be keeping governments and citizens up at night? I'm putting climate change and pandemics and terrorism and global criminal activity and migrants and refugees. Yes, I'm worried about nuclear proliferation too, but those are going to be high up on anybody's list. You would not create the United Nations or the World Bank or the IMF or the World Trade Organization or any of those subsidiary organizations to deal with that. So we're in a period where we have to evolve. We have to figure out how to connect those two worlds, the states that are still important. I'm not arguing states are disappearing. They're not. But the chessboard world and the web world, the powerful national governments alongside cities, networks of cities, and then again, citizens and corporations in ways that I can't tell you what it's going to look like, but I can tell you that I think the traditional institutions are going to look more like hubs of web networks than they are going to this kind of, I almost think of it as a Wizard of Oz institutional world driven by a small number of states.